So I've set the Rotovap up off camera, and both the cinnamic acid and the vanillin solutions have been drying over their drying agent long enough that I'm fairly confident they're dry. You can see that when I swirl it and stop, right, there's still a little bit of free-flowing drying agent. Same with the cinnamic acid. So now we're ready to mass a couple of round bottom flasks. And I dried these guys in the oven last night. But since we have smaller volumes, right, we only have about 30 milliliters this time, we can probably successfully use 50 milliliter round bottom flasks instead of hundreds. And that will make it easier to scrape out the solid. So I've got two different ones here. I've got a Quark 50 milliliter flask with the blue labeling. I got a Chemglass 50 milliliter flask. So I'm going to use the Quark for the cinnamic acid and the Chemglass for the vanillin. So I'll be able to know which one's which. And we're just going to weigh those two. So we'll be able to get our crude yield by difference. So the Quark flask for the cinnamic acid is 53.550 grams. And the Chemglass flask, which we'll use for the vanillin, is 54.498 grams. And in both of these cases, all I need to do is decant the MTBE, trying not to take any of the drying agent with it. In a recovery flask like this, when you're rotovapping, you don't want it more than about 2/3 full, because that will increase the chances of bumping. Bumping is less of a problem with MTBE than with diethyl ether, though, because it boils higher. So we can definitely get away with rinsing it just a little. Tiny bit of MTBE just to make sure that we don't leave any solid product attached to our drying agent. And hopefully the fact that there's just a little bit of a tint of color to the vanillin solution this time is an indication that we actually have some vanillin in there rather than the kind of nothing we had before. So we'll do the vanillin first. Turn on our pump. Attach our little adapter and our flask, and start the rotation, and then we're going to close our system and then open up the vacuum to our pump. And just in case there's some dissolved air, I've got my thumb at the ready in case it starts to bump a bit. We have a small enough volume in the flask, though we're well below the 2/3. Should be in good shape. MTBE boils enough higher than diethyl ether that we probably will actually see it condensing and dripping, whereas diethyl ether often doesn't collect in the flask. But you'll see that it's taking longer for the condensate to form on the outside. You can also hear the sound of the pump change. When the sound of the pump changes like that, it's probably finished pulling all the air out of the system, and it's ready to start pulling solvent. So we're going to lower that into the water bath, which is heated to about 30, and just let that evaporate. While that's going on, you can dip a little bit of a ice water bath out of the that bucket. And we're going to cool this, hopefully, tryptamine solution. A little bit of color this time we've got. So the tryptamine may not have come out quite as pure as it did in the previous extraction. And I'm going to turn on my vacuum. And get some filter paper. So it covers all the holes. And grab a pipette for ice water. We can wet that. Make sure we get a good seal. Scraping away to try to suspend the solid that's attempting to walk up the sides of the beaker. And then I'm just going to filter that. Trying to keep it suspended as best I can so I don't lose too much to the walls of the beaker. Pull out as much of that solid as we can, and we'll use some ice water to rinse the rest of it out. Definitely not pure white, but that's okay because we're going to be purifying the tryptamine by recrystallization anyway. And finally we'll just try to wash that down so it's all down in the bottom on the filter paper. Be easy to remove and rinse any traces of base away from the tryptamine. So there's definitely quite a bit of solid in there, not as pure looking as the previous run. but it looks like we've got quite a bit, so 0.5 molar hydrochloric acid seems to have done a perfectly adequate job. We'll let a little bit of air run through that. And I can put the MTB away, and it does look like we got quite a bit of white solid in the vanillin flask this time. That is much more promising than yesterday's run. The burning question is whether the cinnamic acid actually extracted well, but we know we had some solid precipitate that we extracted, so we know there's something in the cinnamic acid flask. And we can pull that out. Dry the flask off. We don't want any water on there when we mass it. And then we want to always disconnect the vacuum first and let the air in. And only after that's complete do we turn off the rotation and remove our flask. Definitely some solid in there. Hopefully it'll be scrapable. And now we'll take the cinnamic acid solution and rotovap that one down as well. You hear the sound of the pump as it pulls air. It gets really deep, kind of a rumbly. And then after it's done pulling the air, it will go back to that high-pitched sound, which will tell us that the solvent is being removed. You can hear the sound of that pump gradually changing. And I'm waiting for a little bit of condensation on the outside of the flask, which will tell me solvent is starting to evaporate, some dripping off here, and the sound of the pump tells me it's time to lower that. So we'll let that finish. Time to break the vacuum on this tryptamine. And as we did yesterday, the previous extraction, we are going to find a clean 10 milliliter beaker, maybe, and label it tryptamine, and stick that in the desiccator overnight. Inside a 50 milliliter beaker so it won't fall over. But I'm going to get a mass in the beaker. With the label and the tape before doing that transfer. So the empty beaker is 8.484 grams. 8.484 grams on the beaker. Filtration adapter away. We scrape that solid out. And it's usually not worth trying to scrape the stuff away from the filter paper. It's much easier to get the tryptamine away from the filter paper once it's already dried in the desiccator overnight. The wet tryptamine tends to stick to things. And we're losing a tiny little bit, but not enough to worry about. So that's going to go inside a 50 milliliter beaker. And sit in the desiccator to remove the residual water from the filtration. You can see there's quite a bit of white solid in that flask, which is good. Hopefully that's cinnamic acid. I'm going to dump the drying agent, at least as much of it as I can, into the solid waste. And we'll let that evaporate. That's probably finished. Just rinse these flasks out and then we can grab that.